With the covenant renewed and the people ready to cross into the land, the stage is set. Israel is ready to take its inheritance, or perhaps I should say, God is ready to deliver the inheritance to Israel. What we will see in the book of Joshua, what God is trying to show his nation, is that as they obey him in faith, he keeps his promises. He will do exactly as he said. Actually, I should say it a different way. As they obey him in faith, he will give what he said he would give. He will bless them. But if they turn away from him in disobedience, he will also do what he said. He will also be faithful to his promise, and he will bring judgment. So God, showing he keeps his promises, is intending to motivate his people to maintain faithfulness. The book of Joshua can easily be divided into two sections as well. In the first part of the book, we see Israel practicing obedience, so to speak. So the first 12 chapters, if you will, deals with the initiation, the preparation, chapters 1 to 5, and the conquest, where God actually gives them the land in chapters 6 through 12. The fruit of obedience is as God divides up the land among the tribes for their inheritance, and then finally Joshua is going to give them a charge to stay loyal, to stay faithful. What we'll see then is God is going to front load this. He's going to spend 5 chapters on introduction. Just the first few months of their conquest is a full 5 chapters. Of course, this whole book takes between 35 and 75 years, depending on how you want to count the chronology. But the conquest, which takes a full 7 years, is chapters 6 through 11. So obviously this initial part is important to God. The final part is at the end of Joshua's life, and he's going to announce the necessity, the need for Israel to follow God in obedience, or they're going to be destroyed. God is holy. God is jealous. God is not a God to be trifled with, so they must be careful in their obedience to God. The first 5 chapters present the initiation, if you will, of the nation into the land. It presents God's encouragement to the land. He is calling them so that they can actually present themselves right and they can be victorious. And there are some things that they have to deal with, that they have to change. So in chapter 1, God says to Joshua, hey, get up and go into the land. I'm going to give you this. This is for you. But you have to go and trust me. I'm with you. So he declares his presence. In chapter 2, he shows them that he's already gone before. So when the 2 spies go in and talk to Rahab, what they hear is that the Canaanites are already absolutely shaking with fear, and God has gone ahead of them. In chapters 3 and 4, God symbolically shows that he is going before them into the land as he leads them across the Jordan River, shows his power, and he presents reminders as they build piles of rocks to remember that God is bringing them into the land. God is going with them. And then finally, in chapter 6, as they have to consecrate themselves, they have to practice circumcisions, which they've neglected for 40 years. They remember with the Sabbath that God has, or with the Passover, that God has indeed done what he has said, and they will have to obey him. They must obey him. In fact, the manna stops because now they're able to take the produce of the land. And finally, God shows them again he's with them with the captain of the Lord's army. So God's presence is very significant in these 5 chapters, recognizing that they will obey, if they will obey, that God in his presence will give them victory. In chapters 6 through 12, we see the conquest. And the main thing to notice here is the first part of the conquest is the most significant part, or the largest part, if you will, of the narrative, as we see God's victory as he gives them Jericho, as they obey in detail. But as one of them disobeys, they see defeat at Ai because of Achan's selfishness. So we recognize that obedience brings blessing, disobedience brings judgment, brings discipline. And God is showing them that they must follow him carefully because he's holy. So he begins with a central campaign, southern campaign, northern campaign, and then we have the summary at the end. These campaigns, as we look at the map, it helps us to see what God is doing. God, as he's bringing them across the Jordan, is using the initial aspect, the central campaign, to divide and conquer the enemy armies. He will then go to the south and give them the southern aspect of the land of Canaan, and then he will take them to the north, and the northern part will become their inheritance as well. So divide and conquer, 3 campaigns showing God is giving them the land just as he promised. In chapters 14 and 19, so we see the division of the western side. God has already divided the eastern side for the 2.5 tribes, but on the western side we see the 9.5 tribes getting their inheritance. So very graphically, as he describes each of the cities that they are to inhabit, God has done what he has said. As we see God doing what he said, however, we see a growing unease. We see a problem. The problem is that even as God gives them the land, they fail to take it progressively. Initially, the tribe of Judah starts, and he did pretty good. They did pretty good. Now, Transjordan, the tribes on the other side of the Jordan, the eastern side, did not possess the whole land. That's chapter 13. But when we get to chapter 15, we see the tribe of Judah couldn't drive them all out. Why not? Lack of faith. It's not because the Canaanites were so strong. God has already told them they are stronger than Israel. They do not trust God, or they are not obedient. And as we move through this whole section, we see tribe after tribe after tribe after tribe do not drive out the Canaanites, cannot drive out the Canaanites, and in fact, finally we get to Dan, the final tribe. They can't take any of their inheritance. They have to go up to a little undefended town in the north to find something to live in. But again, we see a progressive failure of Israel. Now, it's subtle, it's in the hints, it's in the small print. But God is showing us that as he is faithful, Israel is not fully being faithful, and that's going to show up again in the book of Judges. The last 2 chapters, Joshua challenges the nation of Israel to obey. And he gives them chilling words. He tells them if they will cling to God alone, they will be victorious. But if they cling to any of these other gods, they will lose. God will leave them in the land. There'll be thorns in their eyes and whips in their sides. And God is going to destroy them with these other peoples. The book of Judges is going to take up this challenge. And the book of Judges is going to look back at this promise and evaluate how Israel did. The book of Judges, then, is evaluating Israel's response to God. How will they do? Well, we know the answer, mostly because we've read the story, but as we come to the book of Judges, we see a progressive decline, progressive failure to follow God, progressive disobedience as they embrace other gods instead of embracing Yahweh. Instead of being loyal to God alone, they allow other kings to take their allegiance. So what the book of Judges does, as it describes this period of time from the end of the conquest to the beginning really of the united monarchy, it unveils or pulls back the curtain from the apostasy of the nation of Israel and shows their progressive decline and how bad it was that they were becoming worse than the Canaanites themselves. In doing so, and in showing the resulting judgment, God is warning Israel of impending disaster. He does it in numerous ways, but through each of the cycles as they disobey, God brings judgment, and it gets worse and it gets worse. But not only that, we see the decline of the judges themselves, which also shows the impending doom, because the final judge, Samson, as you're reading notes, is really a picture of what the nation of Israel has become. The book of the Judges, then, can be broken down into really a major section with an introduction and a conclusion. It's a 2-part introduction and a 2-part conclusion, but actually that's what it is. So the first chapter actually looks back, and this is my picture of an eye looking back, because Israel is supposed to remember what God has done so far as God gave them the land. But as they look at what God did in giving them the land, he also looks carefully at the progressive rebellion, their progressive decline at not driving out the Canaanites, their failure, if you will. In chapter 2, the author looks ahead, and he looks at the cycle of the judges. He looks at a paradigm, if you will, of what's going to happen as Israel has the land. They turn away from God. As they turn away from God, God brings about judgment. As God brings about judgment, they cry out for help. Well, actually, in the paradigm, we don't see that cry, and in fact, later, we don't see it in the paradigm either. But we see God's grace in giving deliverance as he raises up a deliverer, and then, of course, they have rest. But even as it says in chapter 2, it gets worse and worse and worse. Chapters 3 through 6 then give us 6 progressive declining cycles of the judges. There are 6 major judges. That means there are 6 judges that have large sections written about them, and there are 6 judges that have just a verse or 2 written about them. Of the major judges, each one of them goes through the same cycle in which we see the progressive decline. As Israel turns away from God, God brings judgment. They cry out for help, at least at the beginning. God brings relief and then rest. But not everything continues, and we see in this progressive decline not only a growing challenge for the judges in the fact that they themselves are becoming more Canaanized, but we see a greater challenge for the nation as they are under more severe judgment. Finally, in the conclusion, we see that Israel is really declining to become very much like the Canaanites that they've dispossessed. So initially it's idolatry, chapter 17 and 18, much as chapter 2 focused on their idolatry, so chapter 17 and 18 is going to focus on their idolatry. And then in chapters 19 through 21, we're going to see that the Israelites are performing the same horrific acts that the Canaanites did. And in fact, it is reminiscent of Sodom and Gomorrah, as the Levite takes his concubine to a Benjamin city, and she is raped to death, and then he dismembers her to call Israel to arms. And just as in chapter 1, Israel failed to drive out the Canaanites, so in chapters 19 through 21, they failed to bring about justice as they attempt genocide, unwisely probably, but they do not even bring the perpetrators to justice. The cycle that we see throughout, as I've mentioned several times, is their rebellion brought about God's judgment. God's judgment causes them to cry out for help. Now that cry for help dims, and in fact, in Jephthah, God says no, but he delivers them anyway. And then finally with Samson, Israel not only refuses to cry for help, they actually want Samson to go away so that they can be back under their judges. God brings rest at the beginning, but as we move on through it, we see that rest declining until finally the last few judges, there's no rest at all. So there is a progressive decline as we move through the book of Judges. As we consider this decline, notice that the judges are arranged chiastically, again framing. Why? Because Gideon seems to be very significant as the central judge. Gideon is oftentimes understood or thought of as a good judge, and in some ways perhaps he was. He delivers Israel from Baal at the beginning. However, at the end, we have some significant problems, and he raises a very significant theme, because the people come to Gideon and they say, hey, we'll make you king, we'll make your sons king. And Gideon says, oh, no, God should rule over us. What he fails to say is God should get all the glory, and he seems to be taking glory for himself, and he does things that make him look like a king, taking the booty, making the ephod, and naming his son, for example, my father is king. What we see with Gideon is that Israel now is fighting Israel. Idolatry remains. In fact, at the end of Gideon's life, he makes an idol. So he delivers them at the beginning, he makes an idol at the end that enslaves them again. And there is no real relief. There is no rest after the death of Gideon. In fact, his son enslaves them again. He wants to be king himself. That's Abimelech. Abimelech, of course, is not really a judge, so I have him in parentheses, but he fits into the narratives in contrast to Deborah and Barak. When we get to Samson, we see the epitome of Israel and what they become. Israel now has rejected deliverance. They're more concerned about what they get and what they feel. Israel is blind to their own source of life. They're unwilling to cling to God. And Samson, as a microcosm of the nation of Israel, not only loses his sight, but he loses his life. He has everything going for him, but because of his own appetites, his own desires, his own eyes, he loses. And of course, Israel is doing what is right in their own eyes. That is the frame of the book of Judges. There's no king in Israel, and every man does what's right in his own eyes. As your reading notices, and I agree with your reading, the issue here is not just they don't have a human king. The issue is they're not bowing before their divine king. Yahweh is not acknowledged as king. And so the issue becomes, what is God going to do? Will he destroy them? Will he give them up to the immorality and idolatry that this frame presents? Israel has turned their back on Yahweh. How is he going to respond? He will respond, but it's going to be a surprise. The book of Ruth is the surprise. During this dark, dark period In the book of Judges, in the period of the Judges, when every man does what is right in his own eyes, we see a few faithful covenanters. Now, actually, when Naomi and Elimelech go to Moab, I'm not convinced that they're being faithful. They're running away from Israel. Certainly there's famine. But why are they not being faithful? They give their 2 boys to Moabite women who are not only despised, but they are actually forbidden for marriage. That is not faithfulness. However, in the midst of that, someone teaches Ruth about Yahweh, and Ruth is willing to cling to Yahweh. And so Ruth, choosing to find rest in Yahweh, comes back with Naomi to Naomi's chagrin. What we learn in the book of Ruth is that God is at work to prepare for the nation of Israel when Israel really deserves judgment. How do we know that? Because Ruth ends with a genealogy that will take us to David. And the faithfulness of Ruth and Boaz is going to lead us to God's deliverance in David. If we contrast the book of Judges with the book of Ruth, in the book of Judges there's no king in Israel, but in the book of Ruth David is foreshadowed. In the book of Judges there is nothing but decadence, and yet in the book of Ruth we see a godly remnant, particularly epitomized by Boaz and Ruth, ironically, who is not even Israelite. In the book of Judges they're righteous in their own eyes, and they're looking for what is right in their own eyes. In the book of Ruth they are righteous before God, and God blesses. In the book of Judges, God brings judgment, but in the book of Ruth, God gives blessing. So that Naomi at the beginning says, I've come back empty, and she sees not only Ruth as nothing, she sees her as a negative drag. But when we get to the end of the book, Ruth is no longer nothing. Now she is more precious, more valuable than 7 sons. God has been at work. And in fact, in the book of Ruth, we see that when you least expect it, and when you cannot see it, and when things are at their darkest, God is working to prepare for what is to come. And that is so encouraging to Israel, and I think it should be very encouraging to us. So don't expect to see God at work, expect God to work.